A very good morning to one and all who have joined here for the first ever virtual DNACon 2021. Um, these 2 days, past 2 days, we were conducted very well, and was is little bit we got a positive effort. And today also we are going to do the same. And I would like to thank Dr. Rachel and our nursing superintendent Ranjit Kar ma'am for giving an opportunity to organize this virtual conference. And this is the first experience for us by virtual. Uh, so let me start our today's session with Dr. Divya MR, Assistant Professor, Department of Neurology, AIMS. Ma'am is going to discuss about myasthenia gravis, what every nurse should know. I hope that ma'am is ready. Good morning, ma'am. You can start your session.
Okay, I'm sharing my slides.
Yes, ma'am.
Morning all. At the outset, I would like to thank Delhi Neurological Association and especially Professor Achal and Neuro Nurses Forum for giving me an opportunity to talk about the very important topic, myasthenia gravis. So the learning objective will be to discuss the role of nurse, starting from the diagnosis, identifying the symptoms to the management. So moving ahead to the talk. So, as we know, myasthenia gravis, it is a neuromuscular junction disorder and it is characterized by weakness and fatigability of the skeletal muscles. So, the name comes from the grave muscle weakness and it is characterized by exacerbation of the weakness with exertion and the improvement of the symptoms with rest. So, the pathophysiology behind myasthenia gravis is decrease in the number of available acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction. It is an antibody mediated disorder and it is an autoimmune attack. So, let's see the normal neuromuscular junction here. So, here is an axon of the nerve, which terminate in the neuromuscular junction. And at the neuromuscular junction, we have this is the presynaptic membrane, and this is the postsynaptic part. So, in the postsynaptic part, the acetylcholine released into the synaptic cleft bind to the acetylcholine receptors here, and this it triggers the further muscle activity by a complicated process. So, see the patients of myasthenia gravis here. The antibodies are produced in the synaptic cleft, and which will act against the acetylcholine receptors, and there is increased turnover of the acetylcholine receptors, and the synaptic membrane is also oversimplified, and there are reduced number of the acetylcholine receptors, and so the acetylcholine for acting. So this is the basic pathophysiology. Postsynaptic disorder, antibodies against acetylcholine receptor, resulting in accelerated turnover of the acetylcholine receptors, damaging the postsynaptic muscle membrane, subsequently blocking the active site of acetylcholine receptors. So this acetylcholine receptor, apart from the acetylcholine receptor antibody, there are other antibodies which are directed against muscle-specific kinase, which is also important for clustering of acetylcholine receptors. We have antibodies against low-density lipoprotein receptors related protein, shortly called LRP4, and also many other antibodies recently identified. All these antibody production is T-cell dependent, and most of the antibodies produced from thymus. So, in a patient with myasthenia gravis, thymic abnormality is seen in around 65 to 75% of patients, and the most common abnormality being hyperplasia, which is seen in about 65% of patients. So, how a patient with myasthenia gravis present? Usually, it will be women in their younger age, 20s and 30s, and men presents in their 50s and 60s. So the ratio is always high for female. In younger age group, it is around 7:3, and in the older population, it is 3:2. So the typical patient presents with fluctuating weakness and fatigability. They will have a diurnal variation. They will report the weakness more towards the evening. And typically, a patient presents with cranial muscle weakness. Usually, the lid muscles and extraocular muscles are affected early in the part of the disease. They present with a fluctuating and fatigable ptosis, diplopia, and also other symptoms depending upon the course and severity of the disease. And these symptoms are characterized by exacerbation and remission, especially in the early part of the disease. And there will be some triggers like unprovoked, which will be provoking the infection, like infections, and also some drugs which prescribe for other condition, and many other systemic disorders. So the patients later may have chewing difficulties. So this is usually noticeable after a prolonged effort. For example, after eating 2 to 3 rotis, or while eating meat, like which require more effort for chewing. And the speech may have a nasal quality because of the palatal weakness, or sometimes it may have a dysarthric quality due to the tongue weakness. And sometimes the patient with myasthenia gravis have a peculiar facial appearance, which is called a snarl. It is due to the weakness of the muscles around the lips, which cause the upper lip, the middle portion of the upper lip to rise like this in the figure. And so this is a peculiar appearance. We call it as myasthenic snarl. And the patient may also have difficulty in swallowing due to the reasons described, like weakness of the palate, tongue muscles, and pharynx. And they may have nasal regurgitation, which often lead to aspiration. And the patient may have neck weakness, and typically the neck flexors will be more weak than the extensors. And in 85% of the patients, the weakness becomes generalized, and the limb muscles are also affected. So myasthenia can affect both the proximal and distal muscles, and usually the proximal muscles are more affected than distal weakness. If a patient having only extraocular manifestation for 3 years, they are generally said to have ocular myasthenia gravis. So whatever generalized myasthenia gravis have patients, they usually generalized within a period of 3 years. And 15% of patients can have severe respiratory muscle weakness, which is called myasthenic crisis, and it is a neurological emergency. Mortality is still less than 5% with advanced management protocols. So these are the common factors which can trigger worsen myasthenia gravis, and we should be aware of these conditions. For example, any stress like surgery, pregnancy, any infection, and some of the commonly used antibiotics like aminoglycoside, fluoroquinolones, tetracyclines, penicillin. So the role of the treating team should be identify these factors and to prevent like unwanted crisis. And other things like magnesium, which is commonly used in laxative and antacids, botulinum toxins, and other many of a number of cardiovascular medication. The list is quite partial here. Anesthetics and neuromuscular blockers can precipitate myasthenia gravis. So how will we classify myasthenia gravis? So there is a classification system defined by Myasthenia Gravis Foundation of America. So this is a very simple classification system. We can use it bedside. So the first class is simply ocular myasthenia gravis. Then second to fourth is for mild, moderate, severe weakness, and you categorize them A and B depending upon the axial limb weakness, or B for bulbar and oropharyngeal weakness. Suppose the patient is requiring an NG feeding, his grade will be 4B. And fifth is for patient who is requiring intubation irrespective of the ventilatory support. So with this knowledge of symptoms, we move ahead to diagnostic test. The main part of the diagnosis is clinical, followed by antibody testing. So there are a number of antibodies that we described earlier, like acetylcholine receptor antibodies, antibodies against MuSK, and LRP4 antibodies. The most common antibody we encounter is acetylcholine receptor binding antibody, seen in 80 to 85% of generalized myasthenia gravis and 50 to 70% of ocular myasthenia gravis. And anti-MuSK antibodies are seen in 30 to 40% of antibody acetylcholine receptor antibody negative generalized myasthenia gravis patient. And most of these patients are females, like 85% as reported in the literature. Still, 20% have no antibodies, they are double seronegative, and anti-LRP4 antibodies seen in 1 to 3% of the cases. And there are new antibodies like anti-striational antibodies and anti-IgM bodies, and the knowledge about the antibodies are increasing. So once we got an antibody test, and if it is negative, then we should rely mainly on electrodiagnostic test. So for the electrodiagnostic test, the anti-acetylcholine esterase like medication like pyridostigmine should be stopped at least 6 to 12 hours before the testing. And the most sensitive test in generalized myasthenia gravis is rapid nerve stimulation test, where we rapidly stimulate in succession like 2 to 3 hertz. And if there is a decrement of more than 10%, it is indicative of a neuromuscular transmission defect. And the most sensitive test is single fiber EMG. So I'm not going to into the details of these electrophysiology tests. So just to remember that the main diagnosis is clinical, followed by antibody testing. And if the antibody is negative, the clue for diagnosis comes from electrophysiology. So this is a simple bedside test which we can do. This is called ice pack test. So what we do is when the patient presents with ocular symptoms, so we simply apply an ice pack over his eyes. So after 2 to 5 minutes, we expect an improvement in the ptosis. So if there is a 2 millimeter improvement in ptosis, that means there is a neuromuscular junction defect. Why is this happening? This is due to the less depletion of the acetylcholine receptors due to cold, and also the reduced activity of the enzymes which destroy the acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction. The pooled sensitivity and specificity of this test is quite good. It has an 82% sensitivity and 96% specificity. So this is actually a reliable test which we can do at the bedside. So another test is anticholinesterase test, and the principle is that we give edrophonium, which has a very rapid onset, 30 seconds, and short duration, 5 minutes. So first we give a test dose like initial 2 milligram edrophonium, and if there is this definitive improvement, what will we look for improvement? Like if the patient is having improvement of the symptoms as such, and if there is improvement of his ptosis time, if there is an improvement in his arm stretching, leg rising, and head rising. So there are like we have to define the objectives. So if there is an improvement, then it is a positive test. If there is no improvement, we have to give additional like total 8 milligram extra we will give, and 2 milligram increments. So these are usually used in patients, myasthenia gravis patient who are antibody negative and also having inconclusive electrodiagnostic and ice pack test. The one thing to remember for us is this edrophonium can have unwanted muscarinic effects also, like cardiovascular effects, bradycardia and all. So the attending physician and nurse should be ready and aware of these symptoms, and atropine and other management for bronchial symptoms should be ready, and we should readily manage these patients. And other tests like we order for arterial blood gas to look for type 2 respiratory failure, pulmonary function test, and we ask for a CT test because thymic abnormality is seen in 75% of the patients, and usually seen in antibody positive patients, and the abnormalities are like I described earlier. It's like thymic hyperplasia in almost 75% of the positive thymic abnormality patient, and 15% may have thymoma. And you should work up for other autoimmune diseases also, because hyperthyroidism is seen in up to 8% of cases. And if you haven't identified these patients, it will trigger a crisis. And coming to the treatment, the goal of the treatment is to achieve the remission or at least a minimal manifestation state. So I will be giving the definition later. And the other management, other important goal is to manage the crisis. So we have for crisis management, plasma exchange and IVIG. These are very important tools for us in severe acute exacerbation and sometimes pre-operatively to stabilize the patient. So I'll not be discussing plasma exchange in detail because we have an upcoming talk on plasma exchange. Usually we give 5 to 6 exchanges on alternate days, and it is the treatment of choice in myasthenia crisis because of its fast action. And IVIG is usually given at 2 gram per kilogram over 5 days in moderate to severe exacerbation. And the most important treatment for symptomatic improvement is acetylcholine esterase inhibitor like pyridostigmine. So these are some differential diagnoses, and our role is to identify these symptoms and identify these symptoms based on the clinical and clinical history and examination and appropriate test. So this is pyridostigmine, which is the patient takes for the symptomatic improvement. These are acetylcholine esterase inhibitor, and these are when we take these tablets, the peak blood level occurs in around 3 hours, and the significant clinical effect starts within 30 minutes. Initially, we may have to give 4 to 5 times per day to reach a stable blood levels, and the patient require at least 180, that means 60 milligram thrice daily to 240 milligram per day. And if the patient has renal impairment, the dose have to adjusted. And the side effects are usually dose dependent, and these are in these include abdominal cramps, bloating, diarrhea, urinary frequency, hypotension, etc. And we should be aware of these symptoms. So if these symptoms increases, it is called cholinergic crisis. It's very important because it itself can lead to bulbar and respiratory crisis. This is actually due to drug excess, due to the worsening of myasthenia gravis. So in a patient with dysphagia, when we prescribe pyridostigmine, we should be more careful because it can increase the secretions and exacerbate the swallowing difficulties. So the first strategy in such patient will be to place the nasogastric tube and administer pyridostigmine through that tube. And other symptomatic therapy available are oral salbutamol, a rare clinical utility in mild autoimmune myasthenia gravis, and in the patient with MuSK antibody positive disease, albuterol and 3,4-aminopyridines are helpful. So, as I discussed, if the patient is having just ocular or mild generalized symptoms, we give acetylcholine esterase inhibitors alone. And if the symptoms are not improving, start an immunosuppressive agent. Usually, low-dose corticosteroids will be helpful. If you are not able to use the corticosteroids, or if he develops side effects, or if he develops relapse on tapering, he may require an immunosuppressive agent. And moderate to severe generalized patient require acetylcholine esterase inhibitors along with immunosuppressive agent. So corticosteroids are our first choice for ocular and generalized myasthenia gravis as an immunosuppressive agent. And in the OPD setting, we start very low and titrate slowly because of the fear of paradoxical worsening of bulbar symptoms. And in the patients who require long-term immunosuppression or steroid-sparing agent, these are the agents available for us: mycophenolate, azathioprine, and it is an individualized for each patient. We have to discuss the risk benefit and select the appropriate immunosuppressive agent. And if the patient on treatment no longer require the next dose of pyridostigmine, that means he is stable, and we can withdraw the symptomatic therapy and steroid slowly, not fast. So there are some group of patients, like 20%, that they are refractory. That is, they are unchanged or worsen symptoms even after corticosteroid treatment and at least 2 other immunosuppressants, which are given for adequate doses and duration. And so in these patients, the identified factors include thymoma, anti-MuSK antibodies, young disease, female sex, etc. So these are the conditions which are identified as the factors for refractory myasthenia gravis. So pregnancy should be managed properly, and steroids, IV agent, Flex has no limitation, and even azathioprine is safe in pregnancy. So international consensus guidance for management of myasthenia gravis have put forward these guidelines regarding thymectomy. So it is recommended in non-thymomatous generalized myasthenia gravis patient with acetylcholine receptor antibody aged 18 to 50 years. And in these patients, thymectomy should be considered early. And it is also strongly considered in acetylcholine receptor antibody generalized patient if the patient fail to respond to adequate trial of immunotherapy or patients develop side effect to such therapies. It may be considered in patients without acetylcholine receptor antibodies also if they are not doing well on immunosuppressive treatment. And even for positive ocular myasthenia gravis patients who are not doing well on immunosuppressive therapy, we can consider thymectomy. And for the refractory myasthenia gravis patient, we have rituximab and also eculizumab. These are very good immunosuppressive agent, and especially for MuSK antibody positive myasthenia gravis patients. So once we treat the patient, we see if the patient is in remission or minimal manifestation state. So minimal manifestation just means no symptoms, no functional limitation, but on examination, we may find some weakness. And complete stable remission means no symptoms, no weakness. Some amount of residual weakness of eye closure is accepted, and no therapy for minimum a period of 1 year. And pharmacological remission is same as complete stable remission, except that the patient may have received some form of treatment. So important is to manage the patient in crisis. As I said, 20% of patients present with crisis, and ABG should be monitored, check for respiration, bulbar function. The management options include IV agent, plasma exchange, and plasma exchange is more rapid and it's recommended, and corticosteroids are added or increased simultaneously. So these are few recommendations by the American Association of Neurosciences Nurses put forward for the care of patient with myasthenia gravis. So the recommendation spans from identifying the symptoms to the management of the patient. So they recommend that a comprehensive nursing assessment should be done. So this include a detailed medical history and the symptoms we described. And we should be able to test all voluntary muscles for the muscle strength and also fatigability, and should identify the severity of the muscle weakness, degree of the functional impairment, and also the potential complication. And the history and examination also include a detailed physical assessment of the respiratory status also. So if while assessing a respiratory system, if you identify some problem with the respiratory system, adequate support of respiration should be given until additional interventions are available. And we should be knowing about the adverse effect associated with the both the diagnostic test and also the treatment option, and should be able to manage the side effect. For example, if we administer neostigmine test, we should be aware that the patient can have muscarinic side effects, and the atropine and another management options should be ready. And the monitoring the results and adverse effect, as I said, is important, and you have to manage the events appropriately. And have to familiarize with the electrodiagnostic test like nerve conduction studies and also the RNST, because the patient may feel discomfort. So preparing the patient for their experience and explaining about the discomfort are also like our job. Then administering and teaching the patients with myasthenia gravis and the family about the correct dose of acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, as these tablets will be taken at least 30 minutes before food to facilitate the chewing and all. And also teaching the patient and their family members about the signs and symptoms, overdose and adverse effects. So monitoring of the side effects associated with the immunosuppressive therapy like glucocorticoids and also immunosuppressants should be taught well, and they have to be educated regarding the risk of infection, and also the practicing good hand hygiene practices should be taught to the patient and also family, and they should be educated to avoid exposure to the people with infection. So this is the very important part for the patients both in the OPD and also in the hospitalized patient. So monitoring for the side effects is very important, and the patient should be carefully taught about this. And administering antimicrobial is very important, and also monitoring for the side effect associated with the plasma exchange. So the nurse actually played a crucial role in plasma exchange in our institute. So their job include like identifying the patient with crisis, and also to start plasma exchange as early as possible, securing a venous access, check the patency of the line, check for the complications like deep vein thrombosis, and also any side effect developing during the procedure, and alerting the physician. And also they should be aware of the rationale for using IVIG, the reported benefits and limitation, and also the institution specific protocols regarding the dosages and rates of IVIG. And if any adverse effect patient develops, they should be well versed to manage the adverse effects. So apart from these recommendations, recommendations also include educating the patient and family regarding the role of thymectomy, the indications for thymectomy, and the immediate post-operative care, prognosis of the patients undergoing thymectomy, and monitoring the patient closely for complications related to thymectomy and managing them effectively. And the one thing is that, as we know, most of the drugs can precipitate myasthenia gravis crisis, and the patient in the post-operative period are at risk. So we should be able to balance the administration of medication that may worsen myasthenia gravis as example opioids, with a comfort level that allow the patient to breathe with least amount of effort and discomfort. And there should be a knowledge to differentiate between both the crises. One is due to the disease itself and the other is due to the overdose of medications. And also in either situation, we should be able to perform a complete respiratory and neuromuscular assessment and to identify the ineffective respiratory function and swallowing functions, and to initiate appropriate airway management strategies and oxygen delivery. And the protocols to facilitate swallowing should be adopted, like the patient should be instructed to have food, especially like at 30 minutes of their symptomatic treatment, and heavier meals should be taken in the early part of the day and lighter meals towards the evening, and shorter meals are advised with sips of fluids, and the food is usually given in the upright posture, and the patient should be encouraged to talk less during the food intake, and other distractions should be avoided, and soft non-sticky foods are advice for easy swallowing. So these simple measures will facilitate swallowing and avoid aspiration. And we should discuss the nutritional team also, and optimize the nutritional and fluid status of the patient. So like this is my summary slide. So the key points include: identify a patient with neuromuscular junction disorder, identifying a patient with myasthenia gravis. So it includes a detailed patient history, identifying the fluctuating fatigable muscle weakness, and perform a comprehensive physical neurological examination, test the muscle strength and endurance, identifying the patient with impending crisis like bulbar weakness is setting in, or patient in crisis with respiratory discomfort, identify the adverse effect of medication, distinguishing the myasthenia crisis from cholinergic crisis, and assessing the respiratory function and provide appropriate support, preventing and managing the infection, implement the aspiration precautions as we discussed, and provide patient and family a proper education about the disease. So that's it. Thank you. So if there are any questions,
Stop sharing.
Anybody have any questions, please? Ma'am, thank you so much for the broad topic, and you covered in half an hour. And at the same time, I would like to give a special thanks regarding this, because it's autoimmune disorder, and what every nurse must know that you cleared today, and hope that our nurses may put it in the practice of the daily patient care. And you mentioned about the SNAL. Maybe we may not know about that SNAL, but today is everybody's mind that picture is there. If the patient is showing such kind of facial expression, automatically we may come to know that is a SNAL. And some triggering and worsening factors also you excluded in the slides is very, very important for us while handling the myasthenia gravis patients. So the current pandemic is all about adapting the current situation. So thank you so much for this special Sunday you are being with us. And of course, everyone know that Sunday is the lazy day. We will take a rest, but you were the first speaker and voluntarily you taken the first session. For that, special thanks from our team, DNACON 2021. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, ma'am. Let's move on to the next speaker, Dr. Manoj Palak, Assistant Professor, Department of Neurosurgery, Neuroscience Center, AIIMS. Sir is going to discuss about management of patient in neurotrauma. Sir, please, you can share the screen.
Good morning, everyone. I'll be discussing management of patient with neurotrauma. So head injury or traumatic brain injury in India, we almost see almost 15 to 17 lakh cases in a year, and which are disabled due to traumatic brain injury. And what is the role of nursing professionals? So the care starts right from the initial management to the rehabilitative care. And the full impact of TBI and the skills they have can alter the course of recovery in a patient. So the care of traumatic brain injury starts from pre-hospital care, and the goal is to prevent the secondary injury. So we must understand whatever primary insult had to happen has happened already. We cannot reverse that. But we have to prevent secondary injury to the brain, which comes in the form of hypotension or hypoxia. So adequate training is very, very vital. And it has been shown by various studies that intubation done by poorly trained paramedics is often counterproductive, or these patients tend to do very poorly. So whenever we encounter an unconscious patient, never ever forget that spine may also be involved, because patient may not be moving limbs at all. And we had done a study at AIIMS itself, and we found that in patients who are unconscious or have severe or moderate traumatic brain injury, the incidence of cervical spine injury is almost 26%. So never ever forget spinal injury, especially in cases of high energy impact. So if there is a suspected cervical spine injury, hold the neck immobile in line with the body. You may apply a rigid or a semi-rigid collar, and the head may be secured to the trolley with sandbags and tape. So suppose this patient came to the casualty, just patient was wheeled in, got a CT scan done from some other trauma center, and was referred to the place. There will be lots of hustle and bustle that, there is a massive ADH, patient has a poor GCS and may need something to do. But never ever forget the elementary things. That is the ABC. So airway, breathing, circulation, disability assessment, exposure and examining for any additional injuries, and vital signs documentation is must for these kind of patients. Meanwhile, you have to do other management as well, like intubation of the patient, ensuring adequate oxygenation, monitoring for blood pressure and saturation, inserting wide bore cannulas and starting IV line. We discussed earlier that hypotension is a prime culprit for secondary injuries in this patient. Cardiac monitoring, and yes, sending the blood for cross match as well. Then electrolytes, glucose, and sometimes, alcoholics or patients who are intoxicated, they may also present to us. So we must send the relevant toxicological screens for these patients. And if a CT scan is not available, patient can be planned for CT scan of the head along with cervical spine. That is the protocol at our place, and we have a study to back it up. Now, ICP monitoring is advised for all patients with moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries, and the target is to maintain the ICP less than 20 millimeters of mercury. So the primary injury in the brain can give rise to severe disability due to neuronal destruction, but the secondary injury is due to the cerebral ischemia, and which can occur due to brain swelling, hematoma formation, hypoxia, hypotension. So these must be avoided at all costs. And the indications of surgery I'll be discussing later on. So the most important part is, now that the patient is in casualty, now patient has to be wheeled into different places, either for conservative management to ward or ICU or to the OT. So most important point is that in cases where spinal screening has not been done, a log roll is to be done, and patient has to be transported on a spine board. Cervical spine injury, if suspected, a collar is helpful, and support to the vital organs and monitoring should be continued. Now, the most important thing which I want to emphasize today is, I have given a previous talk on neurotrauma management for nursing professionals as well, but today I'll be talking on another point of view. So neurosurgery in trauma is mainly to prevent the herniation syndromes. So understand what is herniation. The most common hernia we know of is inguinal hernia. So it is a natural orifice through which a body part is coming out which is not supposed to come out. And then in the process, it gets strangulated and causes lots of problems. So what happens in head injury is that the brain, CSF inside the skull, and the blood volume is constant. So if there is a swelling of the brain, right, or there is a blockage of CSF pathways, the pressure is going to increase and the autoregulation is affected and patient goes into decompensation. So what happens is that brain, all the nerves and everything exits through foramina. So brain also has certain openings. So between the tentorium, there is a tentorial notch, and the spinal cord exits through foramen magnum. And in supratentorial compartment, there is a falx cerebri. So I'll talk of all these things later on, but we must understand that neurosurgery is essentially to prevent the herniation syndromes and the catastrophic morbidity and mortality associated with it. So conservative and operative management, both I'll discuss. The most important thing when you get a patient is positioning of the patient. So head end up by 30 degrees facilitates venous drainage. And as we discussed earlier, that blood, CSF and brain is constant. So if brain is swollen, you have to facilitate the venous drainage. Then whenever we are positioning these patients, never forget in the ICU also, we have to do a log roll and with appropriate protection for the cervical spine. The other important thing which everyone must be aware of, irrespective of whether they are in neuronursing or other nursing specialties, is Glasgow Coma Scale. So appropriate assessment of patient is very, very essential, and any deterioration in sensorium must be documented meticulously. Then a pupillary reaction is also very, very important. So whenever you are doing a suctioning or positioning the patient, assessment of pupillary reaction is also a good habit to take note of. And actually it is one of the signs to indicate that herniation is occurring. So this is the stage where, even if the GCS has not deteriorated that significantly, patient may be considered for surgery. Then important point is managing the respiratory tube. So once patient is in ICU, patient will have lots of indwelling catheters and endotracheal tube, and appropriate suctioning is necessary at regular intervals, because the blockage or partial blockage of the tube can cause CO2 retention. And such is the dynamics of CO2 that if CO2 rises, the intracranial pressure rises. And while you're doing a suctioning, you can also take note of the cough reflex of the patient as well. Cough and gag reflex. And regular suctioning is essential to prevent ventilator-associated pneumonitis as well. So what happens if PCO2 rises? So the intracranial pressure rises, and it is expected or desired to have a PCO2 level between 35 to 45 mm of Hg. So this we can achieve with hyperventilation. If patient is on ventilator, we can increase the respiratory rate and it brings down the ICP. The other issue is temperature management. So there have been many trials regarding use of hypothermia. There is a very curious incident. Benjamin Franklin of United States believed that hypothermia is good for human body, and he used to roam around naked for almost half an hour every day in cold. So hypothermia, why they say it is protective is because it brings down the metabolism, and hence the swelling and other metabolic factors are controlled very well. But trials have found that hypothermia, especially moderate and severe hypothermia, is rather counterproductive. It increases the coagulation disorders and various other disorders. So normothermia should be maintained. So we should not aim for hypothermia. We should not aim for hyperthermia. A normothermia should be maintained. And then the most important thing is to maintain stress ulcers. So after head injury, Cushing's ulcers are described, and they are very, very common in ICU patients. So early feeding, use of proton pump inhibitors or H2 blockers, or surface coating agents like sucralfate is desired and recommended. Regarding nutrition, so starting nutrition is very, very important. It should be started as early as possible. Sometimes the patient may be on borderline, patient are being monitored for their intracranial pressure, and you'll feel that, patient should be started on nutrition. But if the patient is relatively stable, patient should be started with feeds as early as possible. If patient has a tendency to deteriorate, which the surgeon may discuss with the treating team, then patient has to be kept nilperorally. But it has been found that early enteral feeding should be started within first 72 hours, and full feeding should be started by day 7 itself. Then the other issue is that patients with traumatic brain injuries often develop coagulopathy, specifically patients who have severe traumatic brain injuries. So what happens is that since the hematoma size is very big, often there is a consumption coagulopathy, and which leads to a picture like DIC. So in these patients, we should always take into consideration, since you never know which patient might require a surgical intervention during the course of ICU care. So coagulation parameters should be corrected. And sometimes elderly patients will have a history of platelet or aspirin intake or some anticoagulant intake. So these factors always should be kept in mind. And since nursing professionals are the one who are more in contact with the family members, they should also take a note of certain things, because patients are not able to give history by themselves when they are presenting with severe traumatic brain injury. Then another important point is management of glucose. So it has been found that hyperglycemia has a poorer outcome when head injury management is concerned. But a study done in 2008 found that very intensive control of sugar has led to also poorer outcomes because of hypoglycemic episodes and subsequent cardiac events. So it is prudent to maintain the blood sugar level around 140 to 180. And more than 200, we should start some intervention. Then, as I told earlier, hypotension is one of the prime causes of secondary brain injury. So fluid therapy is very, very essential. Then if patient is having hyponatremia, then hypertonic saline can be given for correction. Also, hypertonic saline has an effect of reducing the intracranial pressure by osmotic means, and euvolemia is the goal of our treatment. An arterial line should be used for checking the blood pressure invisibly. Then CVP monitoring. Since we are giving fluids, it is mandatory to check whether patient is in fluid overload or patient is in fluid deficit. So always take care of the CVP line and the proper functioning of CVP line, and waveform is very, very essential. If the waveform is not present, the CVP readings may not be correct. So always check for the waveform, even if the CVP line is patent. And if it is not in use, flush the cannula with saline and heparin. So I have spoken lots of things about intracranial pressure. How do we measure it? How do we know what is the intracranial pressure? So till now, we have seen CT scan, we have seen pupillary reaction, and in some cases, we can also do ultrasound, but I'm not going to touch that topic. So the other way of doing ICP measurement on a continuous basis is to put some catheter inside the skull. So it can be a ventricular catheter, which is external ventricular drain or intraventricular catheter. It can be intraparenchymal, it can be subarachnoid, it can be subdural, or it can be measurement through external fontanelle. So the best of these is ventricular catheter, that is the gold standard, and the most commonly used catheter is intraparenchymal, which is relatively easier to put, because in these patients, often due to swelling of brain, the ventricular system is either compressed, chinked, or shifted. And the technology is based on simple piezoelectric effects, or it can be based on strain gauge, just like CVP measurements. So in this case also, just like CVP measurement, it is very, very important to check the waveform of the ICP measurement, because sometimes the waveform may be dampened and the catheter may be misplaced from its side. So if we are doing a strain gauge method and we have put the catheter is not in the ventricular system, it has migrated to the parenchyma, then it may not show the correct pressure, and vice versa. So normal ICP waveform has 3 waves, and I'll not go into details of this, but you should remember there are 3 waves. If you can see 3 small notches on a hill, that is a normal ICP waveform. So another important point, which is very, very important, is zeroing of the system, or rather the calibration of the system. So any measurement has to be taken from a reference standard. Like if we take a CVP value, if we take manual measurements, we take the level of the heart. So for ICP measurement, we take the level of the tragus. That is the level where we have to do a zero. And before putting in the catheter, we have to check for the calibration and zeroing. What happens if ICP is raising? So it can be prevented by first positioning. As I told earlier, 30 to 45 degrees of head and up. First is positioning. Then patient can be administered sedation in form of propofol, fentanyl, or midazolam. And then there is ICP lowering therapies, which is mannitol or hypertonic saline. And steroids are not recommended in traumatic brain injury. So this is one situation where there is a level 1 evidence that steroid should not be given in traumatic brain injury. Rest all medication, rest all treatment patterns, they don't have a level 1 evidence, but steroid has level 1 evidence that it has not to be given. And in refractory cases of raised ICP, despite all these measures, barbiturate coma can also be administered. So mannitol, what it does is it is osmotic diuretic. So it will pull out all the fluid from extracellular compartment and it will be excreted through kidney. And the role of anti-epileptic drug is also controversial. So it has been said that anti-epileptic drugs will prevent early post-traumatic seizure, that is seizures up to 7 days, but late from post-traumatic seizures are not prevented by phenytoin or levetiracetam. So it can be given up to 7 days. Also, it is important to know that sympathetic dysfunction can also occur in this patient starting from day 1 itself, and it may last several weeks and should be treated on basis of the symptoms. So this is a step ladder kind of an approach. So when we are having a patient, first we have to do a head end elevation and then sedation, correct sodium values. If there is a hyponatremia, obviously there will be brain swelling. It has been found that if there is hyponatremia, the fluid will migrate from intravascular to extravascular compartment and cause edema. So vasogenic edema may be caused by that. And maintaining the cerebral perfusion pressure. So CPP, cerebral perfusion pressure, I'll come to this in the next slide. So if this fails, then put a EVD and drain some CSF. So as I told earlier that the brain, CSF and blood volume are constant. So if you take out some amount of CSF, it will be back from the stage of decompensation. Or we can give mannitol or hypertonic saline or hyperventilation. Then step 2 is doing a decompressive craniotomy. So many studies have proven that decompressive craniotomy indeed brings down the intracranial pressure. The DECRA and rescue ICP studies have proven that it brings down intracranial pressure. However, it has some other issues, which I'll discuss later on. And then saline bolus of hypertonic saline can be given or propofol can be given. And even if it doesn't work, then hyperventilation and thiopental coma can be considered. So intracranial pressure, I told you the pressure which we measure by putting catheters inside the brain. What is cerebral perfusion pressure? So cerebral perfusion pressure is when we measure the pressure of brain getting perfused by blood. So it is mean arterial pressure minus intracranial pressure. And there are two concepts of management of neurotrauma. One is ICP guided therapy. When ICP rises, you do everything for ICP. And the second is that you direct all of your efforts towards maintaining a cerebral perfusion irrespective of ICP. So the goal is to keep ICP less than 20 and perfusion pressure more than 60. And early recognition is very, very essential. So this is a summary in nutshell. Now, monitoring is also very, very essential. And if we are monitoring ICP and mean arterial pressure, then only we can know what is the cerebral perfusion pressure. It is an indirect derivative of these two values. So when we are monitoring these two values, we are able to detect injuries and secondary potential for secondary brain insults earlier. There was another concept which was known as cerebral microdialysis. This is more of an investigational tool than management tool, and it has not much influence on management of patient. It just shows that in the area of injury and surrounding areas of injury, what is the status of metabolism of brain, and whether brain is going towards hypermetabolism or lactic acid production. So surgical management is done when patient has a moderate or severe traumatic brain injury with an identifiable lesion inside the brain, or patient has impending herniation features on CT scan or MRI, whichever is done. So decompressive craniectomy does help, as I told you earlier, but there is no evidence to support whether decompressive craniectomy really improves mortality and quality of life. So like in this case, for EDH, we usually take 30 ml volume as the operative criteria, irrespective of patient's GCS score, because it is said that any compression onto the brain will cause neuronal loss. So even if this blood is, let's say, resolved over next 2 or 3 months with a conservative management, still the patient's neuronal loss will be there. So a large EDH must be evacuated. Specifically EDH which are in progression. So this EDH is all hyperdense. Now, what if the core was slightly blackish? That is hypodense. It means that the EDH is still going to evolve. In these cases, we are going to operate this EDH. For acute subdural hematoma, it is said that a thickness of more than 10 mm or a midline shift of more than 5 mm. So in this case, you see, this is more than 10 mm and the midline is somewhere here, and the ventricular shift system is here. So it is almost shifted by more than 10 centimeters. So these are the cases when herniation is going to happen and you have to operate. So you have to take out the hematoma, you have to do a decompressive craniectomy, remove the hemicranium of the patient, and do a nice lax duroplasty so that the brain expands. And once the swelling subsides after 7 to 10 days, the secondary chances of secondary insults are less. If there is an evident mass effect, even with intraparenchymal bleed, we can take it out, because as I told you earlier, it causes increase in ICP. And in diffuse axonal injury, when there is no demonstrable lesion, there is often just diffuse brain swelling. So decompressive craniectomy has been found to have a mortality benefit, but it causes higher morbidity, and it has been shown to reduce ICP though. But various studies have disputed the role of decompressive craniectomy as far as survival benefit is concerned. So these are contusions patient may present with it. So as I told you, herniation syndrome. So why it is dangerous? I told you earlier that brain will herniate through something. It will compress against the rigid tentorium or bony structures, and then there will be loss of function. So it can be a subfalcine herniation through the tentorium, through the falx cerebri. It can be a transtentorial herniation. It can be a foramen magnum herniation. So I'll skip the clinical pictures of all of them. Patient may also present with fractures. So it may be a walled fracture, it may be a basal fracture. So basal fractures are notorious in producing otorrhea and rhinorrhea. So majority of the cases, if we see, we don't need to put lumbar drain because these patients will have some intracranial lesion, and in this case, chances of herniation is high. So, and majority of the CSF leaks have been found to subside within 1 week with conservative management alone. And role of antibiotics is not clear. And if there is some penetrating injury, just a debridement and dural closure is enough. In cases of compound fracture, we have to do a debridement and closure. And depressed fracture also, we have to intervene because often these have compound injuries and these are impinging onto the brain. And sometimes underlying dural defect, if not repaired, can give rise to a growing skull fracture later on, specifically in children who are less than 10 years of age. And then this is a very peculiar CT scan which I've kept. So if you see a CT scan like this, where you can't see any sulci gyri, there is no white and gray matter interface, it all looks black, and the cerebellum looks white, it indicates that patient has gone into diffuse hypoxia and is unsalvageable. So post-operative care is also very important, and mechanical ventilation and tubing should be managed properly. These patients also are at risk of DVT, and we should put them on pneumatic compression devices. So ongoing management, patients are prone to develop pressure sores, and pillow, skin barrier cream, topical creams can be used to prevent the ulcer. Then catheter associated infection are also very, very common, and around 80% of UTI are attributed to indwelling urethral catheter. So we must prevent inadvertent handling, and hand hygiene is very, very important. Then contracture development is also very common in traumatic brain injury patients, specifically who have severe or moderate traumatic brain injuries, and passive stretching is the most common, and patients should be splinted. And then tracheostomy should also be taken care of. Patient and their relatives should be taught how to take care of tracheostomy and suctioning, because often these patients are discharged on tracheostomy. And also taking care of tracheostomy means reducing the risk of VAP. So in hospital, rehabilitation should start, and it should continue in the at home also. So the nursing professionals have a bigger responsibility of teaching patients, and it has been shown that it improves the cognitive dysfunction and various activities in these patients. So muscle strength is improved, physical function is improved, hospital and ICU length of stays are reduced, and mechanical ventilation is also reduced. So cranioplasty can be done later once patient is stable and well rehabilitated, and cognition keeps on improving over time till 1 year of injury. Sleep problems are also very common, and you can ask the patients to maintain a sleep chart and sleep diaries for assessment of these issues. Now, special considerations for spinal injuries. Most of these things I have covered earlier, but these patients often have permanent loss of motor and sensory function and dysfunction of bowel and bladder, along with autonomic instability. So the management is aimed at, just like in head injury, primary injury has happened. Now we have to prevent the secondary injury and how to rehabilitate the patient and establish a good bladder and bowel care. So we use something which is known as ASIA scale. ASIA is a scale to indicate the motor and sensory involvement in these patients. And we must check for effective CNS tissue perfusion, like we checked in head injury patients. The most important thing is compression stocking and abdominal binder, because often these patients will be paraplegic. So I told you earlier, unstable spine, put a cervical collar and do a log rolling, and do effective airway clearance as well. And to prevent bed sores, or rather to preserve skin integrity, turn every 2 hours and use of air mattress. Then bladder and bowel care with softeners or bulking agents or laxatives, and sometimes suppositories and enema can also be given. And when we are planning to discharge these patients, clean intermittent catheterization is also a good option, but better to discharge them on external catheters, while in spine injury, CIC is a good option. Then nutrition, as I told you earlier, in head injury. Postural hypotension is also very, very important concern. And it is very, very important to know that slowly increase the bed angle to sitting position rather than in one quick move. It may take several weeks for this patient to tolerate sitting upright. And joint contractures I covered earlier, and autonomic dysreflexia. So I think my time is up. So any questions? And thromboprophylaxis also essentially remains the same for cranial injuries, except that in these patients, we tend to start them a bit earlier.
Thank you, sir. Somebody is waiting for you for a long time. Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture regarding the neurotrauma. And I hope that we will follow whatever the advice you have given regarding the spinal surgery. And got it? Somebody is calling you continuously. Okay. Sir, thank you so much for the excellent work, and you were always coordinating with me since 2012. You were the JR and I was the junior nurse, and we were worked together. And of course, whenever I have a doubt and whatever the clearance I have to be done, you are the easily approachable person that immediately I would communicate to you to clear all our doubts. And whatever the points you mentioned regarding the emergency room management, positioning, temperature management, and catheter associated infection prevention. This all hope that new nurses maybe got the more information today, and I'm assured that we will follow these all the items whatever you described today's session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good Sunday.
Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Let me move on to the our next speaker, Ms. Puspa, Senior Nursing Officer, Neuroscience Center, AIMS. Ma'am is going to discuss about challenges of nursing care in neurological patient care areas, because ma'am is working in neurological ward. Ma'am, you can carry. You can share your screen.
Good morning to all. I'm Pushpa, Senior Nursing Officer, AIMS, New Delhi, presenting the challenges of nursing care in neurological care, patient care areas. So as we are in the clutches of global disaster, COVID-19 pandemic, warring with the invisible enemy which has endangers the global population beyond the imagination, bringing a lots of fear, stress, and uncertainty. These unforeseen circumstances have made us to think, introspect, and make prompt decision as nursing professional. The biggest challenge we face today is to cure and care for the people with or without COVID-19. But we committed to save the society in recognition to our contribution. In the year 2020 was designated by WHO as the International Year of Nurses and Midwives. The challenges were the countless as the frontline warrior, and I am presenting the few and far regularly while working in the neurological patient area. So I'll be covering the challenges, the changes, the challenges, and the recommendation. Before going ahead, I would like to share some few slides in which the nursing in COVID-19. So nursing time, are you okay? Because we were working beyond the work. Sorry. So before starting, I would like to share some slides nursing and with COVID-19. As we all know, nursing is an art and science of caring. So in this insecure hospital resources and supply and increased potential risk to patient and caregivers, we as neurology nurses resolve to the art and science of the nursing care. The art is communication skill with patient, the colleagues and the relatives, the empathy to care and willingness to help and share. And the science is the performing skillfully the patient care from the diagnostic to treatment. Now, nursing in the pandemic is the testing time for the nurses also, as it has trespasses the boundaries of working, timing, and staffing for safeguarding self and patient. It started from the time home to work and back. In the world of threat, nursing care is no difference. The global population continue to be terrorized by this disease. As the frontline warrior, we are not out of this threat either. Then the nursing care crisis. In the nursing care crisis, the pandemic exposed the chin in the armory of nursing care, in particular, which the ever increasing cases, the healthcare started ailing, and thereafter the surmounting crisis emerged in the absence of infection control training and the safety provision. The self-care prioritized on the patient care. Now I'll be talking about changes. Change, ouch, it hurts, because the pandemic brought about the glaring changes both at the personal and the professional level. I hope we all are aware about these changes. That hurts, but we have to live with it. I'm scrolling few slides depicting these changes. The changes, the nursing personal hygiene, we have to shower, we have to sanitize ourselves before and after duties, we have to clean our home, we have to ventilate air and sanitize our home also. That was the changes which was not in the routine practices. Then the following the universal precaution guidelines of safety and care was the order of the day. In this fearful environment of the work, the frequent hand hygiene, use of PPE, social distancing, standard precaution for all the patients and all the contaminated equipment and material, and judgment in the determining the necessary protecting barriers. Then risk of infection in transporting infectious patient. If a suspected infectious person requires care while awaiting transfer, follow care center policies for isolation procedures, including all recommended PP for staff and staff at risk of exposure. Then the changes were the working with the potential infectious material. We have to use all the PP and all the safety precautions, which we were not following as in pre-pandemic era. Then close contact, we were prone for the close contact while caring for the patient, because being within the proximity of 6 feet of patient with COVID-19 for a prolonged period of time, having direct contact with infectious secretions from the patient with COVID-19. That secretion could be any sputum, serum, blood, or respiratory droplets, because we have to work within the 6 feet distance. Now we have to think that everything except us is suspected of COVID positive. So all articles, material used with the patients are infective. So in that case, we have to disinfect, we have to sanitize everything whichever is in contact with the patient. So it should not become the vector for the infection. And thinking about all these things, the nurses are more vulnerable to infection more than other who the hospital care worker or healthcare worker. And many of the times nurses become the target to get infected, and many end up with the loss of one's own life. Then there is a nursing informatics in COVID-19. The nursing informatics, it integrates the nursing science, computer science, and informatics science to manage and communicate infection in nursing practices. The lack of national or global unified responses to COVID-19 pandemic presents healthcare professionals with the greatest challenge of their careers. So establishing telemedication system and using artificial intelligence was in this COVID, in this era, in this pandemic. So this was the bedside, but beyond the bedside, there were more changes. And apart from these normal patient care activities, the workstation keep up with safety standards and communication of pandemic information to patient attendants and the other staffs gradually become the dose of the day, dose of the work, which was carried forward to family, to community as and when required. The changes were not over yet. Even after taking a heavy toll on physical, emotional, and mental attire. However, the silver lining in this pandemic is that we have the opportunity as a specialty to revisit our practices and change to bail out us from this crisis. So, oh, changes. I don't like it, but it's a crisis, so we have to change. Every person who prepares in one less person which panic in the crisis. So training the nurses on matter of infection is in 21st century should be a priority as it will see an ever increasing emphasis on infectious disease. Nurses should be an essential component since they are at risk of spreading and catching the infectious disease. When we were in the process of changes, this pandemic crisis surfaced. These crises were shortage of personal protective equipment to prevent, essentially to prevent the spread of disease. Then some organizations provided counted PPE, then unavailability of accommodation and transport facility. Many of the organizations have supported the transport facility, but it was from the particular designation, not from the interior. So the commuter faced the problems. Then there were an inadequate quarantine facility. The quarantine facility for those who were working in the COVID areas, the quarantine facility, those who had symptoms of COVID, or those whose families had some the confirmed cases, but they were quarantined in their home only. Then physical exhaustion and mental stress due to working in a unpredictable situations. Then there were lack of health insurance coverage, concern regarding personal and family safety and security, lack of counseling interests, the communication gap between the hospital authority and nursing leaders, which causing confusion and delay in decision, thus resulting in frustration and mental exhaustion, and inadequate supportive services as food and other facilities while on duty. Now, these were the changes which we have to make to cope up with the situation. Now, are we dealing with the challenges to nursing role? Though we were doing everything which we were supposed to do pre-pandemic and during pandemic, but we faced so much of challenges in performing those nursing roles. Like the first is administering medication. Administering medication is the role of the nursing profession, but in this COVID-19, the patient who required nebulized medication or for the virus to become airborne, to avoid the transmission of the patient, the patient kept in the negative pressure environment. Then in assisting with elimination, the most of the patients were presented with nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. The nurses responded to this patient's need in a timely fashion, and infection waste and laundry handled with care to avoid the further transmission of infection. In assisting with mobility, the comatose patient or the weak patient assisted with the range of motion assistance with proper PPE and with the universal precaution standards. And those who were mobile were taught not to spread the disease, not to spread the virus. Then assisting patient health, patient's health, the nurses became more vigilant for the COVID symptoms. The screening increased, thus with and the diagnosis with confirmed cases, those who are confirmed was transferred to a specific facility. Caring for a wounds, the dehydration, diarrhea, need for isolation, and immobility contributed to the increased risk of developing wounds. The nurses increased their vigilance for wound prevention and care during pandemic. Communication. In communication, we communicated to family and patient about the status of COVID, about the COVID status and prevention and preventing the risk of infection. Managing care. In managing care, the new units were established, and prior to this, a special assignment were made. The suspected, and the confirmed were placed accordingly. Delegating work is to reduce the in and out of rooms, the number of people exposed. The nurses were required to fill in on some duties which were covered by the other people and technologists. Documentation, the nurses paid specific attention to the papers, the tablets, the writing utensils that were in the use of suspected patient, as they could be the vector of the disease, and the visitor were restricted. The emotional counseling. In emotional counseling, the nurses, as many of the nurses were themselves stressed and concerned, so it was difficult to console the patients and the family and the community. The patient hygiene. In pre-pandemic, family members and the personal maid were involved in hygiene activities, but during pandemic, this was discouraged, and further increasing the nurses' role and duties. Making evidence-based decision is, as the virus was recently identified and little was known about this, how it spread. No official guidelines on the PPE or mask. Collecting specimen and interpretation, the sample, the screening for patient was increased, and which required the appropriate the PP, wearing of PP, and the result were as interpreted, means we were looking for the result. So if the positive is, it should be shifted to the designated place. The nutrition and hydration. In nutrition and hydration, it was the priority, but due to the isolation or the other COVID symptoms, it was given the priority. The disease prevention and health promotion to the diagnosed COVID-19 patients were reminded that they have to wash hands and wash hand frequently, wear masks, stay in the cubicle till the transfer. Designated equipment were used. Nurses and the other staffs were reminded to follow universal precaution. Setting priorities is the patient healing was the priority, but consistent procedure for screening, monitoring of visitor, staff exposure, and availability of PP prioritized. Teaching patient and family is that family, the patient who did not have COVID-19 were encouraged to follow the universal precautions. Now these changes and stress, changes and challenges ultimately led with the stress and the mental exhaustion of nurses. Now these changes brought the stress at work and beyond. The occupational risk that is at work, the evolving policy changes due to daily changes, COVID-19 safety guideline and administrative policies hampered the work dynamics and home chorus, and unprecedented ethical decisions with the focus of the patient care has dramatically changed in fear of getting infected, undermining the ethics of patient care. These factors ultimately brought the physical, psychological, and mental health burden. Those factors was increasing number of confirmed and suspected cases, depletion of PPE, overwhelming workload, widespread media coverage. the lack of specific drugs, feeling of being adequately supported, fear of infection to family and colleagues, feeling of uncertainty and stigmatization, and high level of stress, anxiety, and depression symptoms. Now, there were some other specific challenges to neurological care workflow that leads to damage of neurological health ecosystem. Now, there were four aspects where the changes were encountered. In inpatient care, the COVID-19 interference with stroke and other neurological complications, the ancillary testing like ECG, CT, MRI, machinery, disinfection, and personal exposure risk, the optimal use of mechanical ventilation and ICU resources allocations, streaming of rounds, or limiting examinations. In outpatient care, telemedication was started, but it was not that beneficial to those who are staying in remote areas. The research was on hold as there were decreased clinical trials and decreased publication, suboptimal learning, training via video conferencing and webinar. Ethics, the difference algorithm of diagnostic and treatment, vice versa, pre-pandemic. Patient on an anticoagulant and low ABC score warranted admission. Patient with progressive neurological disease, not ill enough to be in-hospitalized, suffered. Now, to resolve those challenges were addressed by the 5 R's of COVID-19 care. These were the resolve, our determination to take the critical threat by its horn, resilience. It's prepared us for the rapid cessation of day-to-day nurses challenges. The return, as we speak, we are preparing to return to the normalcy. However, we are not compliance, so we are reimagining the past and learning lessons. And the final is reform to avoid, mitigate, and preempt a future health crisis. Now, these were the challenges, the changes and challenges of nursing care areas. Based on these challenges faced, the list of our concern is long, but we have attempted to address the above issues with following framework. So these are the recommendations, the ABC framework of nursing care. In this, we have the autonomy, the need to have control over one's work life and to be able to act consistently with one's value. The authority, empowerment, and influence over decision, how care is structured and delivered, way of working and organization culture, justice and fairness like equity, psychological safety, positive diversity, and universal inclusion, work condition and working schedule, resources, time, and sense of right and necessity to properly rest and work safely, flexibility, and effectively. The belonging, the need to be connected to care by and caring of colleagues and to feel valued, respected, and supported. The team working, the main is more belonging is team working, effectively functioning teams with role clarity and shared objective, one of which is team member well-being. The culture and leadership, the nurturing culture, compassionate leadership, enabling high quality continuity, continually improving and compassionate care and staff support. And then the contribution, the need to experience effectiveness in work and deliver value outcome. The workload demands levels that enable the sustainable leadership and delivery of safe, compassionate care, management and supervision, the support in the work, education, learning and development, flexible, high quality development opportunities that promote continuing growth and development for all. It is the great responsibility of health administration to protect the nursing and healthcare worker. So we owe to every healthcare provider to make sure that they are equipped with resources that will protect them from harm. It is that nurses and other healthcare workers who left in the precarious and unacceptable situations. No nurses should fear reprisal from administration for voicing concern about inappropriate patient care delivery. So as a leader of national nursing community, I have tried to communicate the challenges faced and the concern moving forward. Our battle with COVID-19 has presented us with learning opportunity and we are determined to win this war and make significant contribution to the health of the society that will be remembered forever.
Thank you so much for the elaborate topic, and ma'am is working as a senior nursing officer in the neurological ward. So fully, completely is the practical experience, whatever is spoken, and which has to be followed by the junior nurses. Thank you so much for the wonderful session. And ma'am is a little bit nervous because of the technological error. So no issues in that. So next, I will call upon our next speaker, Mrs. Ambili Anuraj, Senior Nursing Officer. I'm also working in a neurological ward in a neuroscience center, AIMS. Ma'am is going to discuss about the role of neuro nurses in plasma paresis, because the separate session, separate is like a department. So ma'am is going to discuss about that.
Good morning to all. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Please start.
Is the slide is visible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. A very good morning to all. I am Ambili Anuraj. Thank you for joining me here this morning. My sincere thanks to Anjali and team for giving me an opportunity to present the virtual DNA code. I am here today to talk about the role of neuro nurses in plasmapheresis. Plasmapheresis is a vital but little known procedure that can be undertaken by nurses who have the necessary skills to understand the process and how to perform it successfully. The word plasmapheresis, its meaning the withdrawal of plasma, was coined by Abel in 1914 to describe a process by which all blood is withdrawn from the body and separated into its constitutive parts, the cells being returned to the body while the plasma is retained. What is plasmapheresis? In other words, plasmapheresis is a process that filters the blood and removes harmful antibodies. The process is performed for treating various autoimmune disorders. It is a procedure done similarly to dialysis. However, it specifically removes antibodies from the plasma portion of the blood. Antibodies are part of the body's natural defense system, which help destroy things that are not a natural part of our own bodies, like germs or bacteria. Pheresis or apheresis describes any process that removes the blood, filters and retains elements of it, then returns the blood to the body. Platelets, RBC, WBC, or plasma may be separated. What's the purpose of plasmapheresis? In many autoimmune diseases, the chief weapons of attack are antibodies. In an autoimmune disease, the immune system attacks the body on tissues. Plasmapheresis is used to remove antibodies from the bloodstream, thereby preventing them from attacking their target. Procedure. Plasmapheresis or plasma exchange process broadly involves 5 steps. Installation of the apheresis set, priming, separation, removal of apheresis set. In this process, the blood is removed from the patients through the catheter to the machine and separated by centrifugal method so that the plasma can be discarded. The red and white blood cells and the platelets are returned to the patient along with the replacement fluid. Anticoagulant is added to the blood, is stopped, it clotted. It requires large bore venous catheters to sustain the flow rate required, which is around 30 to 60 milli per minute. The type of catheters we generally use are 12 French double lumen femoral catheter. In case any complications are observed during this process, we do an alternative method using the arterial access by putting 20 gauge IV cannula. If we are using arterial access method, utmost care should be taken. We are using 5% albumin or plasma along with the normal saline as a replacement fluid. Normally, a single plasmapheresis treatment will last for about 3 to 5 hours. The length of the procedure depends upon the patient's body size and the amount of plasma that is required to get exchanged. The patient should take appropriate rest for a short period after the treatment. The patient may require 2 to 3 treatments for each week. In our department, procedure is normally done in alternate days. Role of nurses. Therapeutic apheresis is a relatively unfamiliar area of nursing practice. It involves the separation and removal of blood components and constituents for direct or indirect treatment of conditions spanning a wide range of clinical specialties. It requires a particular set of technical skills and specialized knowledge. The nurse's role in the process of plasmapheresis is very important as the nurse is the one who will direct the patient, coordinate, train, advise, propose changes in care and participate in clinical research. Nurses' main duties are maintaining and improving standards of nursing care, effective use of resources, and improvement in quality both in the life of the individuals undergoing plasmapheresis and the delivery of health services. Role of nurses under pandemic condition. Another role that nurses play during a pandemic is maintaining supplies of medical equipment and protective items such as masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer. These resources can easily become scarce during a crisis, and nurses play a vital role in managing these supplies by properly maintaining the stock records and intending well in advance. We must teach others everything they practice, from symptom awareness and sanitation to disease prevention. At the front line of healthcare, nurses bear the additional responsibility of educating their patients and the general public on how to stay healthy and prevent the virus from spreading. Due to the threat of being infected, the bedside relatives need to be avoided. While information on things like proper hand washing, social distancing, and sanitation can be found from many sources, nurses have a more powerful voice than most. Pre-treatment intervention. First of all, teach about the procedure and what to expect, including what the machines look like, because they have very anxious about. There is a two type of machines are available in our department. The need for arterial and venous insertion sites. Total procedure, we are putting a 12 French double lumen catheter that will long for total 5 cycles. That's why the need for arterial and venous insertion sites and the length of time of the procedure. That is mainly minimum it will take for 3 hours and it can extend up to 5 hours. Giving information, answering questions and addressing concerns, it will decrease the anxiety. After proper explanation, further we need to take the consent. Check the physician order about holding medications until after the procedure. Medication may be removed from the body as an incidental part of the plasmapheresis process. Mainly, we are withholding the morning dose of antibiotics. After completion of plasmapheresis, we will give the antibiotics. Assess vital signs and weight. Baseline parameters are necessary to evaluate for fluid imbalance and response to the therapy. Similar to our drug calculation, plasmapheresis treatment dosage is also calculated based on patient's body weight, height, and hematocrit value. Normally, we are removing 40 ml per kg body weight per day. Assess CBC, platelet count, and protein studies. Clients undergoing plasmapheresis and coagulation problems secondary to hemolysis of cells. That's why we are checking the CBC and platelet count. Check blood type and cross-match for replacement blood products. Hypersensitivity reaction can occur and close monitoring is important. Intra-treatment intervention. Plasmapheresis procedure takes 3 to 5 hours. Around 40 to 60 ml per kg of plasma volume is replaced during this process. First of all, we remove any heparin that is in the intravascular access. After that, we will collect the blood work. It's for CBC, calcium, and fibrinogen. And the excess is flushed with 10 ml of normal saline. Check for any clot in the line. Managing extracorporeal blood volume, that is ECV. Plasmapheresis can involve the removal of a large volume of blood cells or plasma or result in a large ECV, which means replacement fluid must be given. Procedures that remove large volume of blood components normally involve replacement with an equivalent amount of fluid. Managing anticoagulation. Nurses must also think about using anticoagulants to prevent clotting of the extracorporeal circuit and how this will affect patients and their treatment. We are using mainly 2 anticoagulants in apheresis, heparin and ACDA. ACDA means acid citrate dextrose formula A solution. Each works differently on the clotting mechanism and each calls for specific considerations about the patient. ACDA is a calcium binding agent and that binds the calcium ions to prevent clotting as the blood travels through the extracorporeal circuit. Nurses using ACDA requires special knowledge of its side effects such as hypocalcemia and hypomagnesemia. That's why we will, before starting the procedure, we will check the calcium. And management both the patient and in the machine. Venous blood flow. Management of venous access to ensure good flow is a key part of the nurse's role. Inadequate venous access can prevent the procedure from being undertaken or result in loss of blood volume if blood cannot be returned to the patient. Treatment often occurs on a daily or even twice daily. This is so preserving the patency of established access is a vital part of maintaining the success of apheresis and a special element of the skill set of apheresis nurses. In our department, we are flushing the femoral line secondarily with heparinized solution. Post-procedural nursing management. Monitor patient's vital signs, strict aseptic technique in vascular access, heparinization of venous cannula, dispose effluent bag and lines as per waste management, clean and disinfectant machines as per protocol, all articles, liaise with ward nursing staff regarding patient treatment. Main nurse's role is the documentation. Documentation which includes how much plasma is removed, plasma volume replaced, during the during the procedure, there is a chance for occurring complications and which solution is used for replacement fluid. Last, post-procedure vital signs. Management of complications. Post-treatment intervention mainly attributes to management of complications and prevention. First, we observe for dizziness or hypotension. The signs and symptoms include light headaches, dizziness, faintness, increased pulse rate, shallow breath, respiration. Management of these complications include down the head of bed, up the foot of bed, give normal saline, monitor vital signs, and look for drugs. Next complication is allergic reaction and hypocalcemia. The main reason for allergic reaction is due to infusion of external blood plasma to the patient's body. The signs and symptoms of allergic reaction include hives, rash, flushing, swelling of eyes, lips, tongue, breathing difficulty, burning eyes, hypotension, periorbital edema. Management of these complications include first post the procedure, give medication, wait for symptoms disappear. We are giving antihistamines and corticosteroids. If the symptom is persists, then discontinue the procedure. The signs and symptoms of hypocalcemia include paresthesia, perioral tingling, chills, vibration of chest wall, severe citrate toxicity, tetany, heart rhythm disturbances. Management of these complications include decreased AC flow rate to the patient, decreased blood flow rate, give calcium tablet. For severe citrate toxicity, stop procedure and administer calcium. DVT, deep vein thrombosis. This is the main complication. We can manage by using antithrombolytic drugs, heparinization of venous access, using of intermittent pneumatic compression device, and physiotherapy. Hypovolemia is a complication of plasma exchange, especially during the procedure when up to 15% of the client's blood volume is in the cell separator. Monitor for infection and bruisedness at the intravenous port sites. The site of vascular access is at risk for complication and must be routinely and carefully assessed for signs of infection and for bleeding or hematoma formation. Monitor electrolytes, report imbalances, and if there is needed, replace electrolytes as ordered. Potential challenges during COVID-19. Blood component shortage. The extent of the lockdown and its long-term impact on our day-to-day activities was least expected. All the blood donation camps had to be called off across the country, and the only donor pool available were the hospital employees, leaving the stand-alone blood banks at bay. In addition, the donor selection criteria were made more stringent, further decreasing the donation numbers. All these factors resulted in blood component shortage. Consumable logistics and supply. The major challenge during this pandemic is not just the illness, but also the disruption in production and service delivery. Most of the reagents used in blood banking are manufactured abroad, and due to lack of local procedures, the service during lockdown period was hampered. Next, donor and staff safety. In an effort to maintain the inventory, the safety of donors and staffs cannot be jeopardized. Voluntary donors residing at a walkaway distance from the blood bank too might be apprehensive to turn up for donation. The blood collection sites and stations need to undergo thorough disinfection, and disposal of medical waste needed to be handled more thoroughly. Extensive use of PPE kits. The personal protective equipment undoubtedly provide a shield of protection for healthcare workers, fighting the disease as a valuable asset to the nation. However, there have been various problems associated with the PPE, ranging from its shortage to problems arising from heat, dehydration, etc., while wearing them. Conclusion. Plasmapheresis is most useful in acute autoimmune disorders like myasthenia gravis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, AIDP, like etc. Rapid improvement could save the patient's life in neurological diseases that could profit from plasmapheresis. Under this pandemic condition, as it is going to be prolonged fight, impending challenges need to be anticipated in this area also. Thank you. Any question?
Thank you, Vi. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And I don't have any experience in plasmapheresis, but today I came to know that completely how to handle that. And I hope that our juniors also may come to know. And thank you to take the time on Sunday with the family issues, but you accepted. So thank you so much for that. And let me move on to the another panel discussion at 11:30. Please stay tuned. Thank you.